Would you join your hearts with mine in prayer? God of grace and mercy, may the words I share come from my heart, and may all of us here together this day be both comforted and prompted by the still speaking God in our lives. Amen. Probably most of you know, but last week, from Friday until Wednesday, I was able to attend the 34th General Synod of the United Church of Christ. As a denomination, we come together every 2 years, and we have delegates that were allowed from each conference, and we vote on a lot of things. This particular time, we voted on a new president and general minister, Reverend Dr. Karen Georgia Thompson, the first woman president and the first woman of African descent. And so that was a pretty exciting, We changed our bylaws so that we meet in General Synod every 3 years instead of every 2. And that'll go into effect in 2030. But if you want to know if your vote counts, that bylaw change passed by 1 vote. So remember that when you go to the ballot. Every vote does matter. And we also like to pass resolutions. But they have a meaning. We pass a lot of what are called resolutions of witness, and I'll be talking about them over the next few months. Basically what they are is pronouncements, resolutions at a denominational level that ask the local church to lift up and to support and to do things about. For example, we have one that's about single-use plastic that was passed. But it's always up to the individual congregation, isn't it? That's the UCC way. The national setting, which is all of us, speaks to the church, not for the church. So you'll be hearing about some of these resolutions, and we'll see if there's a way that they can live here at FCC. But you know, the prayer I used when I started my sermon, it's one that I've used off and on for a number of years. But I promise you, like most preachers, whatever prayer I use is done intentionally. And one of the things that you heard in this prayer, and you may hear me say on occasion, is how I hope that we may all be both comforted and prompted by the still speaking God. Over the years, as I've worked with people on personal issues and giving direction and suggestions, I've said that my motto for them, and really quite honestly for me as well, is that I hoped that I would comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable. Because sometimes it's me that needs to be disturbed or comforted. And this week, I want to talk about sin. So do you think I want to disturb or comfort? Now, you may be thinking, well, based on the reading from Romans, I'm pretty sure you intend to disturb. Maybe, maybe not. We'll see. Paul here in Romans is describing the paradox of being human. We decide and we want to do one thing, and then we turn around and do what we had no intention of doing in the first place. Now, for Paul, he brings in the law because he believes that the law impacts sin. But then he just makes this reading really complicated because, I don't know about you, I was pretty sure that I didn't understand. But why did he make it so complicated? Why did he bring in all this stuff about the law? You have to know a little bit about Paul to understand that. Well, first of all, when he wrote this letter to the Romans, he'd never been to Rome. So it wasn't addressing a problem, an issue, a conflict, which is true of all his other letters. Remember the Corinthians, he was writing specifically about a problem or an issue. He wasn't doing that in Romans. So consequently, this letter to the church in Rome comes across more as a treatise on systematic theology. And he didn't want to leave anything out. And the reason he didn't is because, you see, he was anxious to warn Rome what all that might befall them, because he saw Rome as the center of his ministry, geographically. That's what his goal was. So he had great plans and great dreams, so he needed to make sure they understood how they needed to behave. So he didn't leave anything out. And the first 8 chapters of Romans, Paul addresses the problem of righteousness. And these chapters are not without controversy. Romans begins with a survey of the Gentile world, which he considered decadent and corrupt. And there are verses in there that have been used to criticize and castigate a number of us in this modern age. And he only had them in there as a means of comparison. But we have chosen to do otherwise with them. But you see, Paul believed in this meticulous obedience to law. He thought you should have complete trust and total submission. Now, and he didn't think that grace freed us. He didn't believe that grace eliminated consequences. And he kind of actually believed that the law defines sin. Without law, sin doesn't exist. He believed that the law was designed for no other reason than our highest welfare. It was meant to make us good. Keep this in mind as you read Paul. He was a human being and a rather tortured soul. I'm not so sure I agree with everything he says, but I understand the purpose of law and that it can make a difference in how we behave. I think of my childhood. I grew up in a town in Southern California we had orange groves everywhere. And our little subdivision was built around orange groves. And the first few years we lived in that subdivision, probably 5 or 6, we didn't have a back fence. You know, we had to kind of collaborate and join forces and money with some of our neighbors to build the fence. And so we didn't have a fence for the first few years, and so there was the orange grove right in our backyard. Well, we were not supposed to go in the orange grove. That was a law. I didn't particularly care for that law. And because we loved to play in the orange grove, because we would do wheelies on our bikes and we would throw oranges at each other, and we were just, and so then we would come in the house and our shoes would be covered with dust and dirt, and our mother would say, "Have you been in the orange grove?" "No." No. Well, I learned the hard way about that law. But then another time, this is kind of hard to explain, but at the end of my street that we used to roller skate down to, there was, there's the street and there's this mailbox, but there's no house for it to go to. So I don't know what we thought it was, but there was no house, and so we kind of thought, well, maybe we can get in. So we took the mail. Yeah, well, it belonged to the house across the street, the Wheelers, and it was this big house, kind of hidden. They owned all the orange groves and everything, and so I can still see us going through this mail. We were so excited. We had no idea really what it was. Now, I didn't know what that law was, but I've not done it again, I can tell you that much. So the law does make a difference when we know it, doesn't it? But now we can't blame everything on Paul. You want to do that, but we can't. Because what we've done in the Christian church is we've taken our interpretation of different things in the Bible and we've used them in ways that are perhaps not the best. Barbara Brown Taylor, who is one of my favorite theologians, writes in a book called Speaking of Sin, The Lost Language of Salvation. She says, very few Christians today share Paul's passion for the religious issue of circumcision, although he addressed it in at least 7 of his letters. Likewise, Paul never spoke of the doctrine of the Trinity, which did not enter the Christian vocabulary until hundreds of years after his death. But we hang on to some parts, don't we? And then we have new ones that come about. So what else has changed in biblical interpretation and Christian doctrine over the centuries as it relates to sin? Well, let's look at the story of Adam and Eve. It's the first recorded act of human initiative. They decide for themselves what was best for them. They exercised their freedom to disobey and to do what they wanted. We all have the freedom to do that, don't we? Well, we continue to tell the story of Adam and Eve. But interestingly enough, the word sin does not appear in the story, and the phrase original sin is nowhere to be found. It wasn't until the 4th century that Augustine turned the tale of Adam and Eve into an explanation for the human tendency to choose evil over good. So original sin is not in the Bible. We made that later. That's why the Catholics started baptizing infants and why we have a tradition even in the Protestant church of baptizing infants. But not because they've done anything. That was Augustine's way of interpreting. So why do we keep talking about Adam and Eve? It's one of our favorite stories, but it's not really about sin. It's a wonderful story. Not because there are no problems in it, but because it tells the truth about the way things really are. We really are free to make disastrous decisions. But every decision we make has a consequence. Because of the early church, interpretations of the Bible have led us to think of sin as primarily an individual disobedience. And this is far from the truth, and it's far from what the Bible actually says. Sin is about a great deal more than individual errors and mistakes. And there are actually 3 different words that are used in the Hebrew Bible to talk about sin. One of them translates as to miss the mark. Another is translated as to act wrongly. And so the word they use in English often is iniquity. The third is to rebel, and is most often translated as transgression. Now, these words encompass a great deal more than individual disobedience. I doubt that any of us would take issue with the idea that we risk separation from God when we miss the mark, act wrongly, or rebel, whether as an individual, a community, a nation, or as a world. But what we've done with the concept of sin is over the centuries, we've privatized it. And we made it about what people's sexual behavior. We've narrowed it, and that's what it's about. It's even more narrow. It's not just about sexual behavior. It's about your sexual behavior, not mine, right? It's always about the other person. And so that's what sin has come to, is simply judgment about people's sexual behavior. Very much the individual, and we forget the harm and the sin, if you will, that we can do as a community and as a nation. And so consequently, in contemporary Christianity, we tend not to use the word sin. We don't like that word. Here's what Barbara Brown Taylor says about it. Abandoning the language of sin will not make sin go away. Human beings will continue to experience alienation, deformation, damnation, and death, no matter what we call them. Abandoning the language will simply leave us speechless before them and increase our denial of their presence in our lives. Ironically, it will also weaken the language of grace, since the full impact of forgiveness cannot be felt apart from what has been forgiven. Grace becomes fairly meaningless if there is no transgression in the first place. So for just a moment, let's take sin out of the bedroom, shall we? It's spent far too much time in there. So what Paul's trying to do in chapter 7, he's trying to give us an example of what happens because we're so human and we want to do what we want to do. We're drawn to something because it gives us a great deal of satisfaction. And then we have an endless stream of excuses of why we did it. We delude ourselves, and my favorite is we think we're going to avoid consequences. Like I thought when I took that mail, But my brother was older, so I'm thinking that mitigates my part of it. We see what is good, but we seem to struggle and have an inability to do it. We recognize the wrong, but we just can't stop ourselves. One of the things that I think happens just before we do it, whether it is some comment we say to someone that is unkind, whether it's something we eat that we know that we shouldn't eat, something action we take that we shouldn't do, there's always this moment before we do it when we have a chance to do something else. And in that moment, we say, nope, I'm going to do it. And then that's not how I explain it, but I've had to clean it up a little. And then we go ahead and do it. There's always a moment, though. We know, but there's this moment and we ignore it. And so that's why Paul's trying to say the law is just trying to help us keep out of trouble. Here's the law, so if we are really obedient, then this won't happen. That's just not true, you know that. God's love for us, God's grace doesn't erase consequences. But what we do to ourselves and others when we sin isn't working either. To ignore that sin is there, to ignore that we make mistakes, we miss the mark, and that we hurt ourselves and other people, that doesn't work either. So here's another idea. There's a young UCC pastor, Reverend Quinn Caldwell, who does devotionals for the Still Speaking group. And he asked us at one time to take a look at redemption in a different way. He writes that and asked when was the last time we heard the word redeemed used in church? Or heard the word redeem used at all? He goes on to write that whenever it was, he's willing to bet it had something to do with coupons. He suggests that's actually what Paul was talking about. Caldwell asserts that to redeem something means to pay a debt that's owed on it. For example, when you take your coupon to the store, we say that you're redeeming it. What actually happens is the store gives you the value of that discount. So Paul's claim is that whatever sins you've committed have been built up a debt, and Jesus has paid it off. Well, Caldwell asks us, perhaps there's another way to think of it. At the root, Caldwell writes, sin is about spending our lives on things that are not worth spending our lives on. Spend enough of your life on the wrong things, and it can start to seem like you owe your life to them. And so Paul keeps trying to say, I think law helps if you know what the law is. I don't know about you, but when I engage in behavior that has missed the mark or have acted wrongly, when I can't own that, when I can't clean that up, it takes precedence. And I have to build up walls and defenses because I've behaved in a way that I know I shouldn't. So maybe what Jesus does and our following him is give us a purpose. And we can devote ourselves when we grow weary of being in bondage to our lesser purposes. Maybe Jesus redeems us not by paying off a debt, but by showing us that we don't actually owe our sins anything. That we have always, in fact, been free to walk away from what it is and how we've behaved and turn back home to God. We can always turn around. Maybe redemption is finding something worth spending your life on. And the power of this passage from Paul is that we are told that apart from God's grace, doing the right thing 100% of the time is impossible, and that there are forces at work in us and in the world which we cannot contend. Hear this, though. We are not alone in the struggle and in this need we have for perfection. We don't often see that, though. We compare our insides to everybody else's outsides, and we always, always, always come up short, don't we? We defeat, in a sense, the incredible gift of redemption God is offering us. And why do we say we're in a losing battle against sin? Who says it's a battle? I don't even think it's a tug of war. Fighting sin is not a battle. It's the human condition. And to look for perfection is a waste of time. We're going to make mistakes. It's the human condition. We're not alone in it. I remember early on, years ago, I had somebody tell me that I couldn't get drunk in recovery making mistakes. I could only get drunk if I insisted upon defending them. Think about that, even if alcohol is not an issue for you. So what do we do with the word sin? Call it what you want, missing the mark, acting wrongly, rebelling. What purpose does it serve to point it out? You know, why do I have to talk about it? Why do I have to admit it? Why can't I just pretend it didn't happen and just go on? Well, the other day, I was attending a 12-step meeting. And a young gal that I've known for a number of years raised her hand and said she'd slipped. You know, she'd used alcohol and drugs again, and so she had to reset her sobriety date. So why did she have to do that? Okay, she made a mistake, but why couldn't she just keep it a secret and just go on? It wouldn't matter. What happens when we do that? What happens when we build walls around our mistakes? What happens when we deny the things we've done wrong? What happens when we treat people we care about badly and we can't own it? You know, sin is not all about great big things. Sometimes they're pretty small. But we keep God and others at a distance when we can't be truthful about ourselves. So I maintain this young woman has a shot to turn her life around, but not if she hadn't told the truth. We cannot live in the darkness, can we? We've got to learn how to live in the light. Another one of my favorite sayings is, that which you cannot embrace, you cannot change. We should embrace the notion of sin with the same enthusiasm we embrace grace. They are both alive in us. We're going to make mistakes. We're already forgiven, and we change our behavior. And we'll do it over and over and over again. There's no reason for us to hide. There's no reason for us to deny what we've done wrong. Don't you know those moments when you've behaved badly and you take care of it, you clean it up? Isn't there a sense of freedom you have that's incredible? That you can look the world and the people in the eye and you're not embarrassed, you're not ashamed, because you've been genuine, you've been honest, you made a mistake. So yes, Paul's a difficult man. His theology is sometimes overly complicated. But he's just trying, in his obedience to the law, to be good. And don't we all do that? We just want to live our lives in a way that we're proud of and that lifts up those we love and those we care about. May we find a way not to be embarrassed by sin. Let's bring it out into the light. Let it be what it is, the human condition. Please pray with me. Gracious God, we are, oddly enough, incredibly grateful that we're not perfect. We miss the mark, we rebel, we act wrongly, we sin. Let us take the power out of that word and help us realize it's just a part of the human condition. But the other part of it is your grace and your endless love for us. Amen.